No one on set expected this interview to take such a serious and uncomfortable turn in front of everyone. What happens when a routine conversation on live television takes an unexpected turn, and a light promotional interview slowly shifts into a moment of visible tension that feels just uncomfortable enough to notice, but not explosive enough to dominate headlines? Make sure to subscribe to Prime Voice, and like and comment for more real talk show coverage. The segment in question took place during a regular weekday episode of The View, a show known for its rotating panel of hosts, casual but often pointed discussions, and interviews that sometimes drift into social or political territory without much warning. On this particular day, the guest was Seth Rogen, who was on the show to promote a new project and discuss his recent work as a producer, as well as his ongoing involvement in the comedy and film industry. From the beginning, the tone of the interview felt relaxed and familiar. Seth Rogen entered the studio to warm applause, exchanging light jokes with the hosts as he settled into his seat. The panel welcomed him in the way daytime shows often do, referencing his long career, his reputation for humor, and his shift in recent years into more behind-the-scenes creative roles. Rogen appeared comfortable, leaning back slightly in his chair, smiling, and responding casually as the hosts asked about his latest project, his experiences working with younger comedians, and how he balances acting with producing. For the first several minutes, the conversation stayed firmly in safe territory. Rogen spoke about the challenges of developing comedy in a changing media landscape, the pressure of keeping humor relevant, and how streaming platforms have altered the way audiences discover new shows. The hosts nodded along, occasionally laughing at his self-deprecating remarks, and the studio audience reacted warmly, clearly familiar with his style and persona. The shift began subtly, in a way that likely wasn't noticeable at first to most viewers. As the discussion moved away from the specific project he was promoting, Joy Behar began steering the conversation toward broader cultural topics. This is a common pattern on the show, where celebrity interviews often blend into discussions about social issues, politics, or media responsibility. Behar asked Rogen about how comedians today handle public criticism and whether he feels pressure to censor himself or adjust his humor to avoid backlash. At first, the question seemed fairly standard, and Rogen answered calmly, saying that comedy has always involved navigating boundaries, and that every generation has its own sensitivities. But then Behar followed up with a more pointed question. She referenced Rogen's past statements about political activism and social responsibility, and asked whether he felt that celebrities, particularly those with large platforms, had an obligation to take public stances on controversial issues, even if it risked alienating parts of their audience. The atmosphere in the studio shifted slightly at that moment. Rogen paused before responding, which is often a small but telling sign on live television. His body language changed, just subtly, as he leaned forward instead of reclining, his expression becoming more focused and less playful. He began by acknowledging that public figures naturally have influence, and that with visibility comes responsibility. But he also added that he doesn't believe entertainers should be expected to act as political leaders or moral authorities. His tone remained calm, but it was noticeably firmer than earlier in the interview. Joy Behar pushed a bit further, suggesting that silence on major social issues can be interpreted as complacency, and that in today's climate, neutrality is often viewed as taking a side whether someone intends it or not. She framed the question as a challenge, asking Rogen directly if he felt comfortable staying out of certain debates when his voice could potentially make a difference. This is where the moment of tension became more visible. Rogen responded with a polite but clear pushback. He said that while he supports activism and encourages people to speak up when they feel strongly, he doesn't think it's healthy or realistic to expect every celebrity to comment on every issue. He emphasized that entertainers are often asked to give opinions on topics they aren't experts in, and that doing so can sometimes create more noise than meaningful dialogue. The way he spoke was not confrontational, but it was more deliberate and measured than earlier. He maintained eye contact with Behar, but his facial expression suggested he was carefully choosing his words. The studio audience, which had been laughing and reacting audibly earlier, became noticeably quieter, listening closely to the exchange. Behar, still maintaining her usual conversational tone, countered by saying that celebrities have historically played important roles in social movements and public awareness, and that choosing not to engage can feel like avoiding responsibility. She framed her point as a generational perspective, noting that many public figures in the past used their platforms to push for change, even at personal risk. Rogen replied by acknowledging that history, but he clarified that he doesn't see activism as something that should be mandatory or expected as part of being an entertainer. He said that people should speak when they feel informed and genuinely motivated, not because they feel pressured by public expectations or social media culture. What made this moment stand out was not any raised voices or dramatic confrontation, but the shift in tone. The exchange felt more like a real disagreement than a playful debate. Both sides were speaking calmly, but with clearly different perspectives, and neither seemed interested in immediately backing down. Other hosts on the panel began to interject gently, as is common on the show when conversations grow more serious. One host tried to reframe the discussion by asking about the role of comedy in social commentary, suggesting that humor itself can be a form of engagement without overt political statements. Rogen agreed with that point, saying that comedy often reflects societal issues indirectly, and that he prefers exploring themes through storytelling rather than direct commentary. His voice remained even, but his posture stayed forward, signaling that he was engaged and invested in clarifying his stance. Throughout this portion of the segment, the audience remained attentive. There were no dramatic gasps or loud reactions, but the energy in the room felt more focused. Viewers could sense that this was no longer just a promotional interview, but a genuine discussion about expectations, responsibility, and the role of public figures in cultural debates. Joy Behar listened carefully to Rogen's explanation, nodding at times, but she still maintained her position that visibility brings an inherent level of influence that shouldn't be ignored. She pointed out that even choosing not to speak sends a message, and asked whether Rogen ever worries that staying neutral could be interpreted as indifference. Rogen responded by saying that he doesn't see himself as neutral, but rather selective. He explained that he supports causes privately and publicly when he feels informed and genuinely connected to them. But he resists the idea that he should comment on every trending issue just because people expect him to. The tension in this exchange wasn't dramatic, but it was real. It reflected a broader cultural debate about celebrity activism, social responsibility, and the pressure placed on public figures in the age of constant media scrutiny. The conversation remained respectful, but the difference in viewpoints was clear enough that viewers could feel the contrast. As the segment continued, the hosts gradually began steering the discussion back toward lighter topics, but the tone had already shifted. Rogen's responses had introduced a more serious layer to what began as a casual interview, and Behar's questions had pushed him into a position where he felt the need to clearly define his stance. By the end of this portion of the conversation, the atmosphere in the studio felt more thoughtful than playful. The audience applauded politely when the hosts transitioned to the next question, but the earlier laughter had not fully returned. It was the kind of moment that doesn't go viral immediately, but lingers with viewers because it feels authentic and unscripted. This was not a confrontation in the traditional sense, but it was a real-time example of how live television conversations can shift unexpectedly, revealing genuine differences in perspective without ever becoming openly hostile. And for viewers watching at home, it felt like witnessing a real discussion rather than a rehearsed segment, which is exactly what makes moments like this stand out on daytime television. As the conversation continued, the hosts attempted to ease the tone without completely abandoning the subject that had just surfaced. This is something that happens often on daytime talk shows, where a serious exchange is rarely allowed to dominate too long without some effort to rebalance the mood. One of the panelists made a light remark about how every interview with a comedian eventually turns into a philosophical discussion about society, which drew a small laugh from the audience and a brief smile from Seth Rogen. But even with that moment of levity, the underlying tension hadn't fully disappeared. Rogen still seemed more alert and thoughtful than he had been earlier in the segment. His posture remained slightly forward, his hands resting together in front of him, which suggested he was still engaged in defending his position rather than just answering casual questions. Joy Behar picked up again, though this time her tone was slightly softer. She reframed her earlier point by saying she wasn't necessarily arguing that celebrities should speak on every issue, but rather that silence can sometimes be interpreted as comfort with the status quo. She explained that in her view, public figures often underestimate how much influence they have, especially among younger audiences. Rogen listened without interrupting, nodding lightly as she spoke. When he responded, he acknowledged that interpretation matters, but he emphasized that intention also matters. He said that he tries to be mindful of where his voice is genuinely useful and where it might simply add to the noise. He also mentioned that social media has created a culture where people expect immediate reactions, even on complex issues that deserve time and understanding. What stood out in this part of the exchange was how carefully Rogen chose his words. He didn't raise his voice or show visible frustration, but there was a noticeable shift in his delivery. Earlier in the interview, his speech had been loose and casual, filled with jokes and quick responses. Now, he spoke more slowly, pausing between sentences, as if he wanted to avoid being misunderstood or taken out of context. The studio audience remained quiet, which is often a sign that viewers are processing something more serious. On daytime shows, applause and laughter usually come quickly and frequently, but during this stretch of the conversation, the room felt more subdued. People were listening rather than reacting. Another host stepped in and asked whether Rogen feels that comedians in particular face a unique challenge, since humor often involves commentary on social norms and cultural behavior. This gave Rogen an opening to shift slightly away from the political framing and back toward his professional identity. He explained that comedy has always been a way to reflect society, but that reflection doesn't always have to be direct or explicit. He said that sometimes making people laugh at uncomfortable truths can be more effective than making serious statements. In his view, comedy allows people to engage with difficult topics without feeling lectured or judged. Joy Behar agreed with that point to an extent, but she added that in moments of crisis or major social change, people often look to familiar faces for reassurance or guidance. She suggested that celebrities can help normalize conversations that might otherwise feel intimidating or polarizing. Rogen responded by saying that he understands that expectation, but he also believes it places an unrealistic burden on entertainers. He pointed out that most actors and comedians are not trained experts in policy, history, or social theory, and that asking them to speak authoritatively on every issue can lead to oversimplification. At this stage, the exchange felt less like a disagreement and more like a nuanced discussion. The tension was still present, but it had evolved into something more reflective. Both sides were clearly trying to explain their perspectives rather than score points or win an argument. What made the moment interesting for viewers was how natural it felt. There were no dramatic interruptions, no awkward silences that required commercial breaks, and no visible signs of hostility. Instead, it felt like a real conversation between people who genuinely disagreed on a cultural question, but were willing to listen to each other. The hosts occasionally interjected with short comments or follow-up questions, but they mostly allowed Rogen and Behar to carry the discussion. This is somewhat unusual for the show, which often features rapid back and forth among all panelists. The slower pace made the moment feel more serious and more personal. Rogen eventually added that he worries about the way social pressure can turn activism into performance. He said that when people feel forced to speak publicly, their statements can become more about image than substance. In his view, meaningful engagement often happens behind the scenes, through private support, donations, or collaboration with organizations that are already doing the work. This comment seemed to resonate with some members of the audience, as a few people nodded and murmured softly. It wasn't loud applause, but it was a subtle sign of agreement. Joy Behar responded by saying that while private support is valuable, public visibility can amplify causes in ways that private actions cannot. She argued that when well-known figures speak out, they can draw attention to issues that might otherwise be ignored. Rogen acknowledged that point and said he doesn't disagree entirely. He clarified that he does speak out when he feels informed and personally connected to an issue, but he resists the idea that he should be expected to comment simply because he has a platform. This back and forth continued for several minutes, with neither side fully conceding. The tone remained respectful, but the difference in perspective was clear. Rogen emphasized personal boundaries and informed engagement, while Behar emphasized public responsibility and cultural influence. One of the hosts eventually tried to summarize the exchange by saying that it seems like the real issue is balance, finding a middle ground between using one's platform responsibly and avoiding performative activism. Both Rogen and Behar agreed with that framing, at least partially. This moment served as a natural transition point in the segment. The tension began to ease, and the conversation slowly shifted toward broader topics about the entertainment industry and public expectations. Rogen joked lightly about how he never expected a promotional interview to turn into a discussion about moral responsibility, which drew a small laugh from the audience and the hosts. The laughter felt slightly relieved, as if everyone was acknowledging that the conversation had become heavier than expected. But even as the tone lightened, the impact of the exchange lingered. Viewers could sense that something real had happened. This wasn't just a rehearsed talking point or a scripted segment. It was a genuine disagreement that revealed how differently people can view the same issue, even in a friendly, professional setting. Rogen's body language gradually relaxed again. He leaned back in his chair, his shoulders loosening, and his facial expression returned to something closer to his usual casual demeanor. Behar also appeared more relaxed, smiling and making a light comment about how these discussions always make her feel older than she already is. The audience laughed, and the show moved forward. But for those watching closely, the earlier tension remained one of the most memorable parts of the segment. It was the kind of moment that doesn't involve shouting or controversy, but still stands out because it feels honest. In the context of daytime television, where conversations often stay safely surface level, this exchange felt slightly deeper and more personal. It showed how easily a routine interview can turn into a meaningful discussion, and how even small differences in perspective can create moments of visible tension when explored on live television. And while neither side won the conversation, viewers were left with a clearer sense of where Rogen stands on the issue of celebrity activism and how Behar views the role of public figures in shaping social discourse. It was a quiet but compelling example of how real disagreements can unfold in real time, without drama, but with genuine substance. As the interview moved into its next phase, the show attempted to return to more familiar territory, but the shift wasn't immediate. There was a subtle aftereffect from the earlier exchange that lingered in the room. Even though the hosts had lightened the tone, the energy felt slightly more restrained than it had been at the beginning of the segment. This is something regular viewers of daytime talk shows often notice. Once a serious topic enters the conversation, it tends to shape everything that follows, even if the show technically moves on. One of the panelists asked Rogen about the changing nature of comedy audiences, particularly how jokes that once seemed harmless are now more carefully examined. This question was framed more as an industry observation than a social debate, but it still connected naturally to the earlier discussion. Rogen responded by saying that audiences today are more vocal and more diverse, which he sees as both a challenge and an opportunity. He explained that comedians now receive immediate feedback through social media, which can be helpful but also overwhelming. He mentioned that while criticism can improve creative work, it can also discourage risk-taking if creators feel constantly monitored. His tone was calm and reflective, but there was still a seriousness in his voice that hadn't been there at the start of the interview. It felt like he was still operating in thoughtful mode, rather than his usual relaxed, joking persona. Joy Behar jumped in again, this time in a more conversational way, saying that she finds it interesting how comedy has become one of the main spaces where cultural tensions play out. She noted that comedians are often criticized from multiple directions at once, and that public expectations seem higher than ever. Rogen agreed, saying that comedy has always reflected social norms, but now those norms change faster than ever before. He explained that what feels acceptable one year can feel outdated or offensive the next, and that this creates a constant learning curve for anyone working in entertainment. This part of the conversation felt less tense than earlier, but still carried a sense of depth. The hosts were no longer directly challenging Rogen, but they were clearly interested in exploring the implications of what he had said about responsibility, influence, and public perception. Another host asked whether Rogen ever feels conflicted about the kind of audience he reaches, especially younger viewers who may take his words more seriously than he intends. This question brought the discussion back to the theme of influence, but in a softer, more personal way. Rogen paused before answering, which again signaled that he was considering his response carefully. He said that he does think about his audience, but he also tries not to overestimate his own impact. He explained that while he's aware people pay attention to what he says, he doesn't see himself as a role model in the traditional sense. He added that he believes audiences are more critical and independent than celebrities sometimes assume. In his view, most people don't blindly follow entertainers' opinions, but instead use them as one of many perspectives. This comment led to a brief reaction from the audience, a mix of light laughter and nodding, as if people recognized the truth in what he was saying. It was one of those moments where the crowd response wasn't dramatic, but still noticeable. Joy Behar responded by saying that even if people don't blindly follow celebrities, familiar faces still shape conversations simply by participating in them. She said that when someone with a large platform speaks, it legitimizes certain topics and makes them more visible. Rogen acknowledged that and said he doesn't disagree, but he emphasized that visibility alone doesn't guarantee understanding. He said that sometimes celebrity commentary simplifies complex issues in ways that do more harm than good, especially when people expect quick, emotional reactions instead of thoughtful analysis. At this point, the exchange had clearly moved into a more philosophical space. It was no longer about a single question or disagreement, but about broader ideas of communication, responsibility, and public discourse. What made this section particularly interesting was how natural it felt. There was no sense that anyone was trying to provoke controversy. Instead, it felt like a genuine attempt to explore a topic that doesn't usually get much time on daytime television. The hosts allowed Rogen to speak at length, which is somewhat unusual for the format. Normally, answers are kept short and punctuated with jokes or interruptions. But here, the panel seemed content to let him explain his perspective fully. Rogen talked about how he tries to separate his personal beliefs from his public image. He said that while he cares deeply about many issues, he prefers to engage in ways that feel authentic to him, rather than performative or reactive. He also mentioned that public discussions often become polarized very quickly, and that he worries about contributing to that dynamic. He said that sometimes choosing not to comment publicly is his way of avoiding adding to a cycle of outrage and oversimplification. This comment subtly echoed his earlier pushback to Behar, but in a calmer, more reflective way. Instead of directly challenging her point, he reframed his position as a personal philosophy. Joy Behar listened attentively and nodded, and when she responded, her tone was noticeably less confrontational than earlier. She said that she understands his concern about polarization, but she also believes that silence can leave space for misinformation or extreme voices to dominate. Rogen replied that he agrees misinformation is a problem, but he's not convinced that celebrities are the best solution. He said that journalists, educators, and experts play a more important role in shaping informed public conversations. This statement drew a small reaction from the audience, again more murmurs than applause, suggesting that people were engaged with the idea but not necessarily reacting emotionally. One of the hosts tried to bring the conversation back to Rogen's current project, asking how these broader ideas influence the kind of stories he chooses to tell. This question acted as a bridge between the serious discussion and the original purpose of the interview. Rogen explained that he's become more interested in projects that explore social themes indirectly, through characters and situations rather than direct messages. He said that storytelling allows people to reflect on issues without feeling pressured to take immediate positions. This answer seemed to satisfy the hosts, as it connected his philosophical views back to his professional work. The tone of the segment gradually began to shift again, moving away from abstract debate and back toward creative discussion. The audience responded with polite applause, signaling that the conversation had reached a natural pause. The energy in the room felt more relaxed, though still thoughtful. Rogen smiled and made a light joke about how he always ends up talking too seriously for someone who makes comedies, which drew a bigger laugh from the audience. This moment of humor felt like a release of tension, even if the conversation had never become openly uncomfortable. Joy Behar laughed as well and said that serious comedians are often the most interesting ones, which helped bring the mood back to something more familiar for daytime television. By this point, it was clear that the earlier disagreement had evolved into a deeper discussion rather than a conflict. The initial tension had softened into mutual understanding, even if the differences in perspective remained. For viewers at home, this part of the segment likely felt less dramatic than the earlier pushback, but more revealing. It showed how the conversation had matured, moving from a single-pointed question into a broader reflection on public life, media culture, and personal boundaries. The exchange demonstrated something that doesn't always come through on talk shows. That disagreement doesn't have to be loud or hostile to be meaningful. It can exist quietly, through different interpretations of the same reality. And while the show continued, and the conversation gradually returned to lighter topics, this middle portion of the interview stood out as the moment where both Rogen and the hosts seemed most genuinely engaged, not as performers, but as people thinking through a complicated issue in real time. As the segment moved further along, The conversation finally began to settle into a more familiar rhythm. The earlier discussion had clearly shifted the tone of the interview, but now the hosts were making a deliberate effort to steer things back toward Rogen's professional work and personal experiences in the industry. This transition felt intentional, almost like an unspoken agreement that the heavier topics had been explored enough for a daytime audience. One of the panelists asked Rogen about how his career has changed over the years, especially now that he's more involved in producing and developing projects rather than just acting. This was a safer, more traditional talk show question, and Rogen responded with visible relief. His posture relaxed further, and his voice returned to a lighter, more conversational tone. He explained that as he's gotten older, his interests have shifted. He said he enjoys helping younger creators find their voice and supporting projects that might not fit traditional studio expectations. He described producing as a way to stay creatively engaged without always being in front of the camera. The hosts nodded along, and the audience responded with gentle applause. This part of the segment felt much more like what viewers expect from celebrity interviews. Reflective but not intense, informative but not emotionally charged. Joy Behar chimed in again, this time asking how Rogen balances his public image with his private life, especially given how visible he's become over the years. Her tone was noticeably lighter than earlier, and the question felt more personal than political. Rogen laughed and said that he's learned not to take his public image too seriously. He explained that early in his career, he worried a lot about how he was perceived, but over time he realized that people will always form their own opinions regardless of what he does. He added that social media has made it harder to separate public and private life, but he tries to limit how much of himself he shares online. He said that maintaining some boundaries helps him stay grounded and avoid feeling constantly scrutinized. This response subtly echoed his earlier points about pressure and expectation, but now it was framed in a more personal and relatable way. Instead of discussing abstract responsibility, he was talking about day-to-day emotional balance. The audience seemed to connect with this. There were a few nods and soft murmurs of agreement, suggesting that viewers recognized the feeling of being overwhelmed by constant visibility, even on a much smaller scale. Another host asked whether Rogen ever feels misunderstood, especially when his jokes or comments are taken out of context. This question brought the discussion back to the theme of interpretation, but in a less confrontational way. Rogen admitted that misunderstanding is part of being in the public eye. He said that once something is shared widely, people bring their own experiences and assumptions to it. He explained that while he tries to be thoughtful, he accepts that he can't control how others interpret his words. He also mentioned that learning to let go of that control has been important for his mental health. He said that constantly worrying about reactions can be exhausting and counterproductive, especially in a creative field where experimentation is necessary. This comment seemed to resonate with the hosts, who nodded and briefly shared their own experiences with being misunderstood in public conversations. For a moment, the dynamic shifted from interviewer and guest to a group of people relating over shared experiences. Joy Behar added a short remark about how live television itself creates misunderstandings, since conversations happen quickly and without the chance for revision. She joked that sometimes she wishes she could rewind and rephrase things she said on air. Rogen laughed and agreed, saying that live formats leave little room for nuance, which is part of why conversations can feel more intense than they actually are. This comment subtly reflected the earlier exchange, almost acknowledging that the tension had been a product of real-time discussion rather than genuine conflict. The audience laughed along, and the energy in the room felt noticeably lighter than it had been earlier in the segment. The conversation had found its way back to a comfortable middle ground. One of the hosts then asked Rogen about his upcoming projects and what kinds of stories he's excited to tell in the future. This was a clear signal that the show was wrapping up the interview and returning to its original purpose. Rogen spoke enthusiastically about exploring different genres and collaborating with new voices. He said that he's interested in stories that reflect modern life in subtle ways, without necessarily focusing on big statements or messages. He emphasized that he enjoys making content that feels honest and grounded, even when it's comedic. This aligned neatly with his earlier views about indirect engagement and storytelling as a way to reflect society. The hosts responded positively, and the audience applauded. The tone was now fully back in familiar territory, supportive, light, and conversational. Joy Behar made one final comment, half joking, saying that even if Rogen doesn't want to be a public philosopher, He's clearly given everyone plenty to think about. Rogen smiled and said that he hopes people take his words as just one perspective, not a definitive answer. This line felt like a quiet conclusion to the earlier disagreement. Without directly referencing it, both sides seemed to acknowledge that the conversation had been meaningful, even if unresolved. The interview began to wind down, with the hosts thanking Rogen for joining them and promoting his upcoming project one last time. The audience applauded warmly as the segment came to an end. From a viewer's perspective, this part of the interview felt like a return to normal, but with a lingering sense that something deeper had occurred. The earlier tension hadn't disappeared entirely, but it had been absorbed into a broader, more reflective conversation. What stood out most about this portion was how smoothly the show handled the transition. There was no abrupt cut or forced change of subject. Instead, the hosts gradually guided the discussion back to safer ground, allowing the audience to process what had happened without making it feel awkward or unresolved. Rogen's demeanor by the end of the segment was noticeably more relaxed than during the earlier exchange. He was smiling more, leaning back again, and engaging with the hosts in an easy, familiar way. Joy Behar also appeared comfortable, joking and laughing, as if to signal that there were no hard feelings and that the conversation had simply been part of a normal, unscripted dialogue. For viewers, this reinforced the sense that the moment of tension wasn't a conflict, but a real discussion that unfolded naturally. It didn't require apologies or dramatic reconciliation, because it never crossed into hostility. Instead, it became one of those subtle talk show moments that stand out precisely because they feel authentic, a reminder that live television can capture real differences in perspective without turning them into spectacle. By the time the show moved on to its next segment, the earlier disagreement had already begun to fade into the background. But for attentive viewers, it remained the most interesting part of the interview, not because it was dramatic, but because it revealed something genuine about how public conversations actually work when people speak honestly and in real time. As the segment officially wrapped and the show moved into its next topic, the immediate energy in the studio felt calm and settled. There was no lingering awkwardness, no sense that the conversation had gone off the rails or needed damage control. Instead, it felt like one of those moments that live television produces naturally, a discussion that briefly stepped outside the usual boundaries of a promotional interview and landed somewhere more thoughtful than expected. The hosts thanked Seth Rogen again, the camera cut to a wider shot of the table, and the audience applauded in the way they always do at the end of a guest segment. It wasn't a dramatic standing ovation or anything unusual, just steady, warm applause. Rogen smiled, waved lightly toward the crowd, and stood up to greet the panel before exiting the set. From inside the studio, the mood was relaxed. The audience chatter that followed felt normal, with people talking among themselves about the interview in quiet voices as the show reset for the next topic. There were no audible gasps, no visible signs of shock or discomfort. It simply felt like viewers had witnessed a real conversation that happened to be more reflective than the average daytime segment. What made the moment stand out wasn't any single line or statement, but the overall shift in tone that had happened earlier. The disagreement between Rogen and Joy Behar never turned into an argument, but it did interrupt the expected flow of a celebrity appearance. Instead of sticking entirely to promotion and light humor, the segment briefly became a genuine discussion about responsibility, influence, and the pressure placed on public figures. For many viewers, that subtle change was likely the most memorable part of the interview. Not because it was controversial, but because it felt unscripted and honest. It was the kind of exchange that feels real precisely because it isn't dramatic. Later that day, clips of the conversation began circulating on social media, mostly short excerpts of Rogen's responses about celebrity expectations and public pressure. The tone of the online reaction was generally calm, reflecting the nature of the exchange itself. Some viewers praised Rogen for being thoughtful and measured, saying they appreciated his honesty about boundaries and not wanting to engage performatively with every trending issue. Others sided more with Behar's perspective, agreeing that public figures have a unique role in shaping cultural conversations and shouldn't underestimate their influence. What was noticeable about the online discussion was how divided it was, but also how civil. There wasn't a clear winner or viral outrage moment. Instead, people shared personal opinions, often relating the conversation to their own experiences with social media, visibility, and pressure to speak out. A few entertainment blogs picked up the story, framing it as a polite disagreement or a thoughtful exchange rather than a confrontation. Most headlines emphasized that the moment was respectful and reflective, which matched how it felt to watch in real time. Joy Behar also addressed the segment briefly in later interviews, describing it as a good example of healthy disagreement. She noted that conversations like that are exactly why the show exists, to bring different perspectives together in a space where people can talk without hostility. Rogen, for his part, didn't make a big public statement about it. He mentioned in a separate interview that he enjoys when conversations go deeper than expected, as long as they stay respectful. He said he didn't feel uncomfortable during the segment, just engaged in a topic he cares about. That response reinforced what many viewers had already sensed. The moment wasn't tense in a negative way. It was simply two people with different views exploring a complicated issue in real time. In the days following the episode, the clip continued to circulate quietly, mostly among viewers who enjoy talk show content and cultural discussions. It never exploded into a major controversy, and it didn't dominate news cycles. Instead, it became one of those small but meaningful moments that stick with people who watched the full segment. From a broader perspective, the exchange reflected something that has become increasingly common on daytime television. Celebrity interviews are no longer just about movies, shows, or albums. They often drift into discussions about values, identity, and public responsibility, even when that's not the original intention. What made this particular moment effective was how grounded it felt. There was no dramatic editing, no raised voices, no forced conflict. The tension came purely from the difference in perspective, not from personal attacks or sensational framing. For viewers at home, it likely felt familiar. Many people experience similar conversations in their own lives, where a casual topic unexpectedly turns into a deeper discussion about responsibility, boundaries, or social expectations. Seeing that dynamic play out on television made the moment relatable rather than shocking. By the end of the week, the segment had mostly faded from the public conversation, replaced by new interviews and new topics. But for those who watched it live, it remained a memorable example of how talk shows can occasionally step beyond entertainment and capture something more genuine. It didn't change Rogen's public image, and it didn't redefine Behar's role on the show. But it did briefly highlight a real cultural tension that many people feel: the balance between having a voice and knowing when to use it. In that sense, the moment achieved something rare for daytime television. It created a space where disagreement felt thoughtful instead of performative, and where viewers were invited to reflect rather than react. And that's why the segment stood out. Not because it was loud, dramatic, or controversial, but because it was quietly real. It showed how a routine conversation can take an unexpected turn, not into conflict, but into something more honest and human. For Prime Voice viewers, it's exactly the kind of talk show moment worth revisiting. A reminder that live television doesn't need spectacle to be engaging. Sometimes all it takes is two people speaking honestly, even when they don't fully agree. So now it's your turn. Share your opinion in the comments and subscribe to Prime Voice for more narration-based talk show stories.